So I want to address the word that comes up for me is turmoil. I want to address the turmoil today. I want to acknowledge it. I want to ask it, as it were, to tell us what it's about and uh, reveal itself a bit to us as what it really is. And so I've done some work on trying to tease out a model that we can use to hold the turmoil. So, the title of the talk today is A Place to Stand When Everything Shifts Beneath Us. I think we could probably all agree that everything is shifting beneath us, and to a degree, perhaps, that we've never seen before. Um, Certainly, the late 60s felt like that, but I think in retrospect, it wasn't. It was an early vision of what was to come, perhaps. But I think now we're really experiencing turmoil. We've always been told, that change is the one constant, that things will always change. But I notice in my life that when things change, they change gradually. And once in a while, there have been very abrupt changes, and it's always a challenge to keep my balance when that happens. One of the metaphors I like to use is the moving sidewalk at the airport. The first time I encountered one of those, you sort of look at it with a little trepidation, and then you step onto it and you're jerked backwards or forwards or what happens. But after a couple of times of getting on and off the moving sidewalk, you know how to adjust. But what's going on now is I think that this is a time of really unparalleled instability, and I would say we're standing on shaky ground. And what's happening, I think, is that recent events are really opening fissures and triggering fault lines in our complacency. Um, like the physical fault lines, they've been there. It's not like the earth is opening up beneath us in a random place. These fault lines have been there, and recent events and recent energy shifts are triggering them and uh, causing us to have to make adjustments to keep our balance. And we are making our adjustments. A trip to the grocery store, for example, has usually been fun. Sometimes there are minor annoyances like, waiting your turn and having to encounter the National Enquirer at the checkout line. But we make our adjustments. Now, of course, we have to add masks to our own shopping bags that we take or whatever. But and we have to come home and wipe certain things down, but we're able to maintain our balance. And but the issue for me is that when I turn on the news or when I look at the headlines on my phone in the morning, and I draw a contrast between what I see is obviously going out there on the world and what I see in the backyard, which I'm looking at now. The contrast is enormous. And I'm constantly being exposed, when I allow myself to an enormous amount of suffering. And so I want to address the turmoil that causes. So this is not like firsthand turmoil. This is like secondhand turmoil. It's like, how do I maintain my balance when I see how much suffering there is and how much um, disturbance and chaos there is out there in the world? Because it seems to me, for many people, the moving sidewalk has turned into an earthquake. I just found a picture here of, I'm not sure where this was, but the profound dislocations that can happen when Mother Earth shifts. Many people are suffering. Many of us are very upset about it. And so the question is, how do we keep our balance with that going on? And I've said this a number of times when I have this wonderful opportunity to address you all or some other group, that I find it's very powerful to find a way to step back, because I've learned in my life that when I get upset, I'm usually too close to whatever I'm upset about. I'm taking it too seriously. It's too real for me. I'm unnecessarily focused on whatever it is that upsets me. So I need to take a step back. And take a step back for me involves telling a new story or a different story or a better feeling story. Um, we all have our own stories, but our stories share a lot of elements. And those elements we learned those elements a long time ago. We learned to tell a consistent story. And in one of these opportunities a number of months or years ago, I talked about how those stories come to be and how we learn to describe our world when we're at the same time as we're learning language. And because we're all learning the same language, and because we're all taught that language uh, by a consistent culture, or a culture that's consistent across not only our country but other countries, the stories we learn to tell about our lives are quite similar. And I think there's a direct correspondence between the consistency of our stories and the consistency of our experience. So the question is, what is a different story? What's a better feeling story? And this is the shameless plug part of the presentation. This is our new book. This is the cover of our new book. It's called The Water We Swim In. So, um, as usual, when I try to speak about topics such as the one I've selected today, I need to do that with a metaphor or a series of metaphors, because it's really hard to talk directly about what goes on beneath the surface, as it were, or behind or within uh, this projection we call the world. So let's look at a metaphor. Think about this, and this is something people thought about 400 years ago. How does the sun hold the earth in its orbit? You and I are used to picking up a rock and holding it so that it doesn't fall. And there's absolutely no confusion or mystery about holding the rock, because there's your shoulder and there's your arm and there's your hand and there's your fingers and there's the rock. And yes, the rock is heavy and the earth is pulling on it, but it's not a mystery as to how we hold that rock where it is. But how does the sun do that? The sun is 93 million miles away, and as far as we can see, there's nothing in between. Empty space. Of course, it turns out that space isn't really empty, it's full of energy, it's full of quantum possibility. But to try to imagine how this gravity thing works, how the sun can hold the earth in an orbit, and any other example you might want to choose, it's hard. It's hard to get your mind around it. But 300 and some years ago, a fellow named Isaac Newton came up with a new way of looking at it. He said, well, rather than talk about some force that you can't see or some binding that you can't see, let's talk about the gravitational field. So he and others invented this idea of the field. So the field is an abstraction. The field is something you can't see. And there are many fields that we talk about in physics, but the one I'm going to use for this purpose is the gravitational field. You can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't detect it with your senses, but you can see how it acts. You can easily detect the uh, the effect of the field. All you have to do is step off something, and you'll know how the field works. You'll know how strongly it pulls you. You'll know how in what direction it pulls you. So the gravitational field again is an invention. It's an abstraction But when you only are looking right here at the local impact of the field, you don't have to think about the sun. The sun sort of goes away in that calculus, and you're only aware of how the field acts. It's a local thing. It's right here, it's right now. And that's much easier to grasp than something that's a whole bunch of distance away. In the way we currently think about it, the gravitational field is part of what we mean by space. You may be aware that rather than talk about a force, Professor Einstein, about 100 years ago, told us that a massive body actually distorts or bends space. The bending of space that actually creates the field that the Earth feels. So it's actually part of what we mean by space, and it affects any body anywhere in the field by telling it how to move. So the gravitational field is telling the Earth how to move where it is in its orbit. And the impact of that effect is proportional to the mass of the body, in this case, the Earth. Now, I'm building a metaphor. This is not a physics lecture, but I'm going to turn this around and have us think about something else using this metaphor. So the question is, how can we use this idea to understand how situations and events affect us emotionally? So imagine a field. This is, you're going to have to invent this for yourself because you can't see it and you can't even prove it exists. But imagine a field composed of 7+ billion points of view. So there are 7+ billion of us. Each of us has a way we see the world and ourselves. And imagine a composite of those 7 billion points of view. Let's call that a field. And let's, just for fun, let's call it the egoic field. I could call it the mass consciousness field, but that's more syllables. I like the egoic field. So I like to use the word ego to refer to the 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 central component of what's looking out at the world, the point of view through which each of us looks at the world. It's a composite of all our personal egos, all our personal agendas, and the dominant worldview of the time. So how does the personal point of view come into being? Well, as I mentioned before, it comes into being when we learn language. The process of learning language generally, I think, starts with nouns. So I have a little graphic here that says this is a ladder, and this is a tree, and this is a house. In other words, our parents were or whoever taught us language, they were teaching us language, and they were using the world and the objects in the world to teach us that language. In the process, we also unknowingly, I think, in most cases, acquired our parents' view of the world. Our parents looked at the world in a certain way, and they used their language to express that point of view, that perspective on the world. And then when they taught us language, they taught us that point of view as well. The composite egoic field, think of it as pervading all of humanity. Now, you could think of it as pervading all of space. That's fine. And since our bodies are all in space, you can think of us all as immersed in the egoic field. This is another way of thinking about mass consciousness, or the way we all understand the world. And just like the gravitational field, it has the capacity to affect anybody in that field, which is all of us. And the impact of that field is proportional to the strength of our beliefs. So I came up with this idea some years ago about, and it wasn't unique to me, others had said this too, but I showed you the title of our new book, The Water We Swim In. The water that the fish swims in represents what we all already understand about the world. In other words, we all know that the world is and always was in some form, and we're transients. We all know that. We come, we go, we see some arrive, we see some depart. The world seems to be there all the time, and we're immersed in that understanding that we're transients and the world is, in some sense, senior to us. It stays when we come and go. So I'm proposing that we think about the egoic field as the water we swim in. And like the fish, we don't notice that we're swimming in that field. We think we're looking objectively at what we see. We think that everything that we see is the way it looks to us. Now, we make adjustments for poor eyesight or poor hearing or something like that, because I'm using vision, obviously, to represent all of our senses. But we don't notice generally that we're swimming in an understanding of the world and we're looking at the world through our understanding. Now, think about the water that the fish is in. The fish doesn't see the water. In fact, it doesn't even know about the water because the water is all it's ever known. In order to know what something is, you have to be able to contrast it with something else or with the background in front of which it appears. The fish has no such ability. It's just in the water, and the water colors or shades everything it looks at. And so I've been underwater without a mask, and I've looked at things underwater in the swimming pool and in the ocean, and things are distorted. If I look at a rock, it looks closer than it really is. The water distorts what we're looking at. If you didn't know you were in water, you would not have a clear view of what you're looking at. So what I'm saying is that we're immersed in a field. We're immersed in an understanding or a description of the world, and that description or understanding distorts what we look at. But because we don't know, we're not aware that we're in that immersed in that field, we think what we're looking at is the way it is. So the egoic field, it's been around since we started using language. It's been around a long time. It's very persistent because we don't know we're in it. We don't even notice that it's there. It colors and shades everything we look at, and it provides a common basis for interacting with everybody else. Because since we share this viewpoint, this common viewpoint that has differences to account for, circumstances of birth and personality and whatever we brought with us to the planet, though there are differences and distinctions, but we share this basis of common understanding. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting, and I've spoken about this before, is that field, the egoic field, wants to stay in control. It wants to be that which delivers to us our understanding of the world. And it stays in control by distracting us from its own intent. That for an individual ego, like my ego, it wants to stay in control. And if I start to employ some of the techniques I've learned, such as meditation and such as taking a broader view, it doesn't like that. It wants to distract me. So as soon as I sit down to meditate and I get comfortable and I start focusing on my breath and I start feeling good, it wants to take me somewhere. It wants to show me some pictures. It wants to even comment on what I'm doing sitting in meditation. It wants to stay in control. It's a jealous master, as it were. First, let's see how it does this. It keeps us focused on competing with one another. I think in almost every aspect of life, I find myself competing. I'm not competing on the playing field, but I certainly want to have the right answer. I certainly want to have my point of view be recognized and honored and respected. And if I think it's better than somebody else's point of view, I certainly want to. I find myself competing with other people that way. This field keeps us defending ourselves from threats. It keeps us focused on achieving and consuming. That's pretty easy to see. And it has us all convinced that we have to, at least us in the Western world and in America, it keeps us convinced that we must measure our self worth by the yardstick of hyper competitive capitalism. I read that online yesterday or the day before, and it was actually shared by President Obama, which I thought was very interesting. But all of this stuff distracts us from being aware of ourselves as the awareness of everything else that's going on. And it keeps us distracted from the idea that we might be in the thrall of a jealous master. And that I'm referring to this egoic field as a jealous master. It wants to stay in control. It does it by keeping us busy and distracting it from its own intent. And the egoic field is intent on its own survival. It's intent on staying in control, on being the master, on delivering to us what it thinks we should know. So what we're doing here is we're starting to separate ourselves from something that we didn't know we were immersed in that colored everything that we looked at. And that thing that we're immersed in it gives us reason to compete with one another, to contend with one another. It's intent on maintaining its own position. And now we're faced with I'm going to shift gears here for a moment. Now we're faced, unquote, with a pandemic. So there is this thing. This image is probably familiar to at least half the people on the planet. And it symbolizes for us a threat. This isn't the first time we've had a threat. It isn't the first time we've had to face a threat, but this sort of brings it all into focus. And I like to call it the thing. And I want to allude to the thing as a story. So let me kind of flesh out the story. People have been attacked by something that they can't see. And that thing is able to jump to another person by contact or proximity. And that thing is capable of producing uncomfortable or life-threatening symptoms. And this thing is real for us human beings. For some of us, it's much more real than for others. For some of us, it's rather abstract. For me, it's rather abstract. I don't think of myself as having this thing. I'm not sure I even know anybody who has had this thing. So for me, it's kind of abstract. But for somebody in the ICU, it's much more real. It's much more tangible. It's much less abstract. And now we have a fight against the thing. So now we have two things. So this is when you are, quote, infected. You have a thing, a white blood cell that is in battle with the other thing, the virus thing. And the fight is a fight between two things. This is the way we've been taught to think about the world and the way we've been taught to think about danger. There is something out there that threatens us. And our bodies are also things in this point of view. You know, we look out through our eyes and we look in a mirror and here's this thing. And if I have this other thing in me, then it's like two objects fighting with each other. Now, what is this thing? What's it composed of? Well, you could say it's composed of cells. You could say it's composed of elements like, carbon and all the other oxygen and nitrogen and all the other things we talk about in chemistry class. You could break it down further and you could talk about that it's composed of protons and electrons and neutrons. And you can go even further and talk about quarks, which doesn't really get us any closer to understanding what these things are. And then you can ask the question, how do they act upon one another? It's complicated. Um, I'm not obviously an infectious disease specialist, but I'm not even sure that Dr. Fauci understands fully how they act upon one another. The point is, it's very complicated. They're both made of elementary particles. And I've spoken to you before about quantum physics that says that these particles don't have any independent existence apart from their observation. In other words, it takes an observer, it takes awareness to bring a fundamental particle or any other object into existence. So what do you do with that? It's just a morass when you try to explain how all this stuff works when you think about these things as things. But let's use the field idea instead, because when we talked about gravity and we couldn't understand how the Earth could be held by the sun over 93 million miles, the field idea was much more useful because it's local. We don't have to talk about something way over there. It's just right here. So let's see if we can use the field idea. I wanted to go back to the example of the gravitational field because the purpose of that field idea was to make things simpler. It's not like this is the way it is. It's not like the field is real. It's a way of thinking about it that makes it easier to grapple with it. And the mathematics that explained how things stay in orbit came out of the idea of the field. So let's think about the pandemic field. The pandemic is everywhere. All you have to do is talk to somebody. All you have to do is go outside and see people walking around in masks, or go to the grocery store and see some people in masks and avoiding each other. All you have to do is turn on the TV or the radio or look at your phone. It's everywhere. So I'm thinking about the pandemic as a field. I'm drawing a distinction, by the way, between the pandemic and that thing I showed you earlier. The pandemic is a story. The pandemic is there's this thing out there and it has marched across the globe and it affects lots of people and a lot of people are dying from it and all that. And for me, sitting here in this lovely town with this beautiful backyard, it's an idea. It's a story. It's not tangible for me. And I realize there are many people for whom it is tangible. So most importantly, the pandemic is a story. What's the pandemic up to? In other words, just like asking, what is the egoic field up to? And I told you that the egoic field, it seems to me, is up to its own survival, staying in control. What's the pandemic field up to? It's interfering with the egoic field. Can you see that? Can you see that the pandemic field has disrupted the egoic field? In other words, the egoic field, you can think about your own ego just, as kind of cruising along through life and making choices that you think will make your life better. And, oh, I'll take this option instead of that option. And, ooh, that option didn't work out well. But, you're in control. Your ego is in control. Your personality, your way of being in the world is in control. And mass consciousness, is kind of in control. Yes, there's suffering and there's dying and there's war and there's malnutrition and then there's hunger and all this other stuff, but it's kind of stable. It was kind of stable until March. And now the pandemic field has interfered with the egoic field. It has disrupted the egoic field. And the egoic field doesn't like it. And you can see that on television every day. The pandemic has interfered with the pandemic has interfered with our blind compulsion to do the ego's bidding by keeping us from competing and achieving. A lot of us who are out there competing and achieving are sitting home, reducing consumerism. I mean, all you have to do is look at the statistics about the economy, and you can see that consumerism, which is what 70-75% of the U.S. economy, has been decimated. We've slowed down. We have lots more time to ourselves. We've slowed down, and it's putting less pressure on ourselves to perform. It's prioritizing family and friends, and it's redefining alone. Alone kind of always had this little vibration in the back of my mind about, well, I should be out there with other people. And now I have a great excuse for not having to be out there with other people. So it has redefined alone. My point is that it has disrupted business as usual for the egoic field. And we can watch it try to keep its balance and stay in control. Think about the egoic field as being the field through which our leaders and our police and our military and our titans of industry look at the world. It's going a little nuts, and that's manifesting for because people look at the world through this field, this egoic field. It's causing all kinds of strange stuff going on. So you can watch the ego try to keep its balance and stay in control just by turning on the news. In watching it, it's like watching an organism. And again, you can't watch the egoic field. You can only watch the results of 7+ billion human beings looking at the world through this field. So it's like watching an organism. When you poke it, it reacts defensively. But it can only react. It can't respond. It's just a story. It's a collective composite story. And it's not real. We invented it. We're real. The egoic field is not real, but because we don't see it, because we're not aware of it, because we don't acknowledge that it's the water that we're swimming in, we essentially do its bidding. But here's the point. By watching it, you will find yourself on solid ground, because the field can't watch itself. It's not real. It's not a being. It can't watch itself. So who's watching the field? Who's watching the field is who we are. And that puts us on solid ground, because who you are, who I am, watching the egoic field try to maintain its balance, thrashing around, try to explain what's going on. By watching it, I'm standing on solid ground. And that's the story that I'm telling myself now. And it's made an enormous difference, not only in my ability to keep my balance, even when things are awful or crazy out there. It's because I'm able to watch it and look at it from a place other than it. So to just go back to actually, let me pull up that slide. To go back to my fish in the water, the fish doesn't know it's in the water because water is all it's ever known. But if you go fishing and you catch him, her, whatever, and you pull that fish out of the water, and then because you're in a catch and release area and you let the fish go, now the fish knows about water. It knows about water because it now has something to contrast the water with. I always like to call that not water. It's the background or the container in which the water takes place. You know, if you look at the picture of Earth from the Apollo capsule or from the International Space Station, there's not a whole lot of water around. It's the blue that you see down there on that tiny dot. You've probably all seen that picture. When you're in the middle of the ocean and you can't see land, it's like there's a lot of water around. But the water lives in a container that is allows you to distinguish it as water. There's a background that allows you to distinguish it as water. And this place that I'm suggesting that we can stand, this place of watching the egoic field thrash around and try to maintain its balance under the influence of the pandemic, and the fissures that have opened up, one of which is this racism thing that is a enormous fault line. It's bigger than the San Andreas fault, and events and the energies that are afoot in our space have opened up this fault line, and we're all talking about it now. This confluence of events, this coincidence of events, has opened up these fault lines, and it's really disrupted the egoic field. And because the egoic field doesn't have a real good answer for many of the problems that we face, that we see now. And so it's easier, I think, to see it as an organism that you can poke and watch it react. And when you're doing that, just to sum up, you do it from a place of solidity, from a place of constancy and of standing on solid ground. And it feels much better than trying to keep your balance when everything is shifting underneath you.